Good afternoon. I'm Angela Greiling Keane. I'm managing editor for states in Canada at Politico, and I'm pleased to be here today with what will be three of our newly elected mayors to talk about economic and pandemic recovery and leadership during this immensely challenging time. I'd like to thank the National Conference of Democratic Mayors for hosting today's discussion. I'm pleased that we have here with us today for this History Makers conversation, Mayors Todd Gloria from San Diego, Brandon Scott from Baltimore, and we will, in a little while, be joined by Mayor Daniella Levine Cava from Miami-Dade County. She has a conflict at the beginning, but she is joining soon. I also want to take a moment as we get started to tell you about the 50, which we launched at Politico about 6 months ago. It's a project where we focus on state and local governments and how mayors and governors are navigating the pandemic and everything else that 2020 and now 2021 have brought us. You can check out our page at politico.com/50. And I also want to invite you to next week's first Mayor's Summit with Politico under the 50 brand. It will be next Thursday, January 21st, the day after the presidential inauguration. And we'll be talking then with the mayors of Chicago, Houston, Oklahoma City, and Phoenix about how COVID has changed their cities and how they'd like to work with President Biden. You can register for that at politico.com/live-events. So today we have with us three mayors who have all just taken office. They're dealing with the worsening pandemic, helping figure out vaccine distribution, economic recovery for individuals and businesses in their cities, and threats of further unrest leading up to next week's presidential inauguration. I'm sure I have left major concerns off of that already long list of what you are all dealing with. We'll start off today with brief opening remarks from each of our mayor guests, and then we'll move on to questions. And if those of us who are in the audience today have questions, you'll find the Q&A link at the bottom of the Zoom. So please go ahead and put your questions in there and we'll ask as many as we can. Let's start off with Mayor Todd Gloria from San Diego. Mayor Gloria is the city's first LGBTQ mayor and also the first person of color to be mayor of San Diego. Mayor Gloria?
Angela, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in. I want to be relatively brief because I find that these things are usually better when we can have a dialogue with the questions, which I look forward to having. I'll just say that this is really well timed for me. I don't know about for my colleagues. I gave our State of the City address just last night, my inaugural address, and really set up, I think, well for this conversation that we're having today. These are not normal times. And when while I think these speeches are often intended to be boosterism, and I will admit that as a bit of our speech was that, it was also a time for really somberness and I think truthfulness for the public. And so, my observation is the state of our city is fragile. And it's fragile, Angela, for the reasons that you were alluding to. We have a pandemic that has literally killed over 1,700 of our region's residents, leaving thousands more sick. We have a budget that was already facing a structural budget deficit, now exacerbating. You can imagine for a city like San Diego, where we are a welcoming city and we enjoy having tourists come visit us, our revenues have plummeted as people have stayed home and not traveled. And as a consequence, this is going to be an extreme challenge to balance this budget the way that our city charter demands us to do. We also have, enormous infrastructure backlogs, the challenges of climate change. We're having some really incredible weather here today for all of our, no matter where you're zooming in from. We have about 80+ degrees today in San Diego. Bad news, we also have really high surf, which is actually knocking down one of our piers as we speak. And that's a combination of infrastructure backlog and climate change at once. And so about a month and a few days into this job, I can tell you the challenges are enormous. The state of our city is fragile, but it can get better. And I think the timing, again, of this conversation is good because we are anticipating the arrival of the Biden-Harris administration next week. And it's my hope that I can band with Democratic mayors, and for that, I would say Republican and independent mayors as well, to get the federal relief that we should have had in the most recent bill, that was a part of previous legislation. Because as I look at my more than $125 million budget deficit, I'm not sure how I'll be able to do what we need to do to curtail COVID-19 without additional funding. I have firefighters that have been authorized to vaccinate San Diegans. I have police officers currently providing traffic control at one of our super vaccination sites in our city. We are expending tremendous dollars, not knowing where we're going to get the revenue from, because that's the right thing to do right now. And I can do it with more vigor and more ability with additional federal assistance, acknowledging they don't have a balanced budget requirement. I do. And I just would point out humbly that we can't build back better unless we're investing in our cities. And I'm hopeful every signal we've received so far from the incoming administration is that they will make good on that, and we should be helping wherever we can to make that happen. Lastly, just to pivot to that boosterism, I'm hopeful that my administration can become a national leader when it comes to addressing homelessness. San Diego is the 8th largest city in the country, but we have the 5th largest homeless population. The previous administration's policies around homelessness have not moved us to where we need to be, and I'm anxious to reorder that. We continue to have one of the most aggressive climate action plans in the nation. And as we build back better, we can do it through a lens of climate justice and equity and make sure that we're, again, a leader in that regard. And lastly, I just want to tell you the most pressing issue I have for my constituents, and this is even in the midst of a pandemic and an economic crisis, is housing affordability. Cities like mine, I'm the son of a maid and a gardener. We were able to live in San Diego relatively comfortably, not perfectly, but comfortably. Stories like mine are probably impossible in 2021 here in San Diego. We have to build more housing that is priced for low and middle income people. Otherwise, we're just going to be a city for the very wealthy who can afford to live here and the very poor who are trapped here. And that is not a great city. That's our vision, to build a great city that works for all of us. So thank you, Angela, for letting me share a few of those thoughts. I look forward to hearing from Mayor Scott.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Gloria. And next we'll hear from Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott. At age 36, he is the youngest mayor that Baltimore has had in over a century. Mayor Scott.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Mayor Gloria, for giving some great remarks, and I can just say amen to many of them. I am glad and honored to be a part of today's event and to represent my hometown, the great city of Baltimore. And I'm excited, really, when I talk about this job and where I am, right? I always say that as long as I've been alive, Baltimore has not been a city functioning and serving the residents in the way that it should, and definitely not through a lens of equity. And I think that's something that we're always going to lead with. My role as mayor is to build a safer, more accountable, and more equitable Baltimore. We will look at the history of how inequitable policies have marginalized vulnerable populations in our city. Baltimore, my city, is the birthplace of redlining via legislation. And in order to move forward, we have to address that foundation. And when you think about COVID-19, what COVID has done is really expose and further exacerbate these inequities that have already existed in our city. And taking office at this time, campaigning during COVID, serving as the city council president during COVID, and now governing as the leader of the city during COVID has been unprecedented, to say the least. I've had to find new and innovative ways to communicate with our residents, creating more ways to access information both online and offline, because we know the digital divide is a real thing. And it's just when you look at where we are in our cities, and the mayor is right, and every indication that we have from this administration is that they understand that it's not just about building back better or going back to normal, as many people say. Normal wasn't good enough for far too many people in our cities. I know that's the case here in Baltimore, where neighborhoods like the one I grew up in, everyone knows Baltimore for the harbor and Preakness. I just happened to grow up in the neighborhood in Park Heights where the Pimlico Race Course sits, where the world descends on it for the third Saturday in May. And every other day of the year, when I was growing up, I was invincible to even my own city government. When you deal with those kind of issues, where you see your first shooting before your 10th birthday, when you go to schools with no heat and air, when you see your friends' families dealing and struggling with addiction and nothing changes, the city continued to operate the same way, ignoring Black and brown communities that are bearing the brunt of these inequitable policies and now bearing the brunt of this COVID-19, we know that we have to build back better and build back better with our cities through a lens of equity. And that's what we're looking forward to doing here. We're going to do that in every way. We are going to force our city government under my leadership to fully enforce our city's racial equity law. We are going to reimagine what public safety means in a city where we are dealing with simultaneously COVID-19 pandemic and a gun violence epidemic. We're going to treat that gun violence like it's a disease. We will attack it from every angle. It won't just be shouldering that burden on our police department, but our health department, our school system, public works, rec and parks, employment development. Every agency has a responsibility to help us deal with the issues that we face. And what we are talking about here in Baltimore is building a foundation of how a Baltimore can truly honor up to our nickname and truly be more for all of us.
Thank you. We will have Mayor Levine Cava give her opening remarks once she can join, which should be in a few minutes. But why don't we go to some Q&A with the two of you who are here to start off with. There's so much ground to cover, but let's start with pandemic and vaccines. Given the lack of a national vaccine strategy, city leaders, along with governors, of course, are having to make more decisions than one might expect that you would at your level about how to get vaccines into people's arms. I'd like to hear from each of you about how that's going in your city and what you expect your role as mayor will look like and also should look like once the Biden administration is in place next week. Let's start with Mayor Gloria, just since Southern California is both such a COVID hotspot right now, and you're also in a state that has been under the microscope for being especially slow to distribute the vaccine so far.
Yeah, I mean, I believe I speak for myself, my mayor colleagues here in California, and our governor, saying that we're unhappy with the current state of affairs. You may know Governor Newsom authorized the extension of vaccinations to Californians who are 65 and older. That's great news. At the same time, it does present some challenges for our ability to meet the additional population at a time when we are continuing to slowly receive vaccines, and we need the infrastructure to put it together. We put in some context for it. You know, we have the parking lot that services Petco Park, where the Padres play normally, is now been converted into a vaccination superstation. We can do 5,000 San Diegans a day there, starting probably tomorrow. We started on a Monday. And this has been a quantum leap, but we need many, many more vaccination superstations. And as Mayor Scott was getting to a moment ago, the inequities that is this pandemic, we need those superstations in some of our Black and Brown communities and our low income communities where we have seen a disproportionate concentration of positive tests and mortality. So while I think the primary and most important thing would have been to have a national strategy, this has been devolved to states and cities. And I don't think I'm happy to take on responsibility, but I need the resources to do it. To do multiple vaccination superstations is hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. And we have some of this with the help of the Padres. We have some of this with the help of the University of California, San Diego. So we are partnering, but to get to the scale that we need, and to do it in a way that gives people confidence. You know, I think we all know that there are portions of our population that are going to be vaccine skeptical, and any kind of logistical challenge has nothing to do with what's in the bottle, is going to give people pause. And it's that pause that will further delay the ability to inoculate our population and get back to something resembling normal, where I can get a haircut, or where I can hug my mom. These are the things we're not able to do right now because we don't have the virus under control and we're not vaccinating fast enough. But sending us a bunch of vaccines without giving us the resources to deploy them and a strategy to do it is a recipe for where we're at now. Again, if people want to send us vaccines directly, I currently have to go through our county, and they have been magnificent, but they too have not been given a lot of resources necessarily to do this. It's going to present a challenge. I suspect that with new invigorated federal leadership, this will change relatively quickly, but it's that opportunity that's been lost, the weeks missed of getting more vaccinations out there to build credibility with the public and get our economies going again. That's what is so bothersome to me. But we're setting that aside and figuring out every creative way to get out there, including, as I mentioned earlier, having our firefighters step up and do this, have our police officers provide that traffic control. we're going to get as creative as possible to make sure that we can get this into as many arms as possible, as quickly as possible.
Thank you, and welcome, Mayor Levine Cava. We've gone on to one question about vaccine distribution, so I'm going to have Mayor Scott answer that, and then after he talks on this topic, we'll turn back to you for your opening remarks.
Yeah, I would just,
Yeah.
yep, Angela, I would just say, echo a lot of things that Matt Gloria said, right? We know that we are not where we need to be, and we know that there hasn't been a national strategy for the vaccine like there was a national strategy to deal with COVID, right? We know since the beginning of this pandemic, the absence of a functioning federal executive level effort around this has turned it over to the states and the local governments. And for us here, we know I'm blessed to have Johns Hopkins Hospital here, to have University of Maryland, some of the leading COVID work groups around the world located here in Baltimore City. Our health department is partnering with them. We're partnering with Under Armour. We are also working with our baseball team and others to try to get larger sites out, but it's also about making sure that we can get these things in coordination, right? Making sure that we're working in partnership with our state to know that we're following the guidelines of who should get the vaccine when, making sure that we get vaccines in high enough numbers to get out quickly, but also get out in a way that we're impacting a lot of folks. We're very hopeful. I'm expecting that we'll see some change from the national level in the coming weeks, but this is about providing local governments the resources to do something that we know is necessary. And as the mayor said, I have no problem taking the responsibility. We just need to be afforded all of the resources necessary to carry it out. This is something that should have been initially done at the national level with a strategy down to the state governments and down to the local governments. But we're stepping up. Our health commissioner, Dr. Jaraza, is doing a great job. We have wonderful hospital partners here. We have wonderful partners in the business community who have stepped up. And we're also, I think, something about the vaccine that I would be very remiss if we did not talk about this. We also have to also understand in communities, Black communities, brown communities, we have to overcome this mistrust of medicine and vaccine. We have to make sure that we're having credible messengers communicating out why we have to get the vaccine, how important it is, why it's safe, why isn't another test from the government on Black and brown people. All of these things come into play when you're talking about this critical vaccine so that we all can get back to doing the things that we like to do. Unlike Mayor Gloria, I won't be getting a haircut, but I do want to go out to a baseball game in the near future and watch the Orioles play, right? I do want to go back to eating crabs out on the deck here in Baltimore, but we can only do that when we get to a point where we have met our goal of beating this virus, keeping people healthy, safe, and alive, and getting the vaccine out to everybody that can take it.
Thank you, and welcome, Mayor Levine Cava. We're glad to have you here. We did have the other two mayors give opening remarks, so I would love to have you do the same. And again, for our audience, Mayor Levine Cava is the new mayor of Miami-Dade, and she is the first woman ever to be mayor of Miami-Dade. So I will turn to you for some opening thoughts.
Great. I'm so excited to be with this group. And, I know they're a good bit younger than I. They got started earlier in their career in the leadership roles, which is great. My personal mission statement is talent scouting for world benefit. So I know you guys are talent that got scouted. I did not run for office until I was 59, 6 years ago. My first role as county commissioner, re-elected, and then now for a 4-year term as mayor of Miami-Dade County. And for those who aren't familiar, the city of Miami is a part of Miami-Dade County. We also have, we have 34 cities. It includes Coral Gables, Miami Beach, Hialeah, etc. There are 3 million of us and a $9 billion budget for the county. That includes our airport and our seaport. So it's quite quite a tall order, and it was not obviously my career goal to do this. It happened because of a calling to take care of pressing issues in our community, and that was why I stepped up to run for office at age 59, and now took it the next step. So none of us expected to run probably in the middle of a pandemic. I sure didn't. The thing about this pandemic is it reveals the underbelly of our society in a way that is just unavoidable. And of course, having the murder of George Floyd in the middle of it just heightened public awareness and dedication to dealing with those issues of racism and disparity in our society. So, I like to say that I am, it was good timing for me. I came of age to deal with these incredible crises that are now showcasing those huge gaps and divides in our society, things that I worked on my whole life as an attorney and a social worker, legal services of Greater Miami, our guardian ad litem court-appointed special advocates program, running the foster care and adoption system, and starting a nonprofit, Catalyst Miami, which is a grassroots change organization. So all of those experiences put me in the right place at the right time to help lead a community through this incredible crisis and build on what I learned, but also to be able to say to our county, we're going to get it right this time. We're going to use this pandemic as a way to rebuild better and not allow it to accentuate the divides, which is what happens so often in an economic downturn. The top does better and the bottom does worse. So, I'm hopeful. We have a new president and a new administration. I'm hopeful that this and a new Senate. I'm hopeful that now we're really going to be able to get the support we need at the federal level. But ultimately, the mayors are the ones that are closest to the people. We're the ones listening every day, addressing their human needs, housing, jobs, transportation challenges, healthcare, violence issues. And again, that's what I've worked on for a lifetime. But I'm very excited to be part of a learning community of progressive mayors. And I'll mention as well that when I was elected in 2014, I immediately joined a group called Local Progress and got tremendous ideas through that organization that I put into practice and have stayed as a member. So I'm excited to be on with this group today. I'm sure we'll talk about climate issues as well. Of course, Miami is ground zero for sea level rise. And we did just appoint a chief bay officer to work with us on our pollution issues in our waterways as well. So that's a few of the highlights. Thank you.
Great, thank you. To help us shape out the rest of our discussion, I want to do a quick lightning round for all three of you. Just make it quick because we can delve more deeply into each issue. But for each mayor here, what is the biggest pandemic response challenge for you in your city right now?
Lack of communication, coordination is what we're working on. And fortunately, a huge demand for the vaccine. Florida was one of the first states to open, particularly to seniors. And, our governor, who won't get into all of it, but he was very adamant it was going to be 65 plus. And it turns out that, look, you know who's 65 and who's not, and you can get to them fairly readily, and they are desperate to get this vaccine. So it's been really a challenge to get the governor to work with us to help us coordinate across the county.
Yeah, I would just chime in and say that Mayor Gloria and I spoke about. It's about resources. I'm not afraid to make the decisions necessary, even when they're unpopular, if they're in the best interest of safety. But it's about having the resources come down to support cities who are making the most important and tough decisions.
Yeah, I would echo that. Resources. You give me the resources, I can get anything done. If you give me a bunch more responsibility and tasks, particularly life or death tasks, at a time when I have less resources, my TOT, my tourism tax is plummeting, our sales is okay. A lot of our resources, our normal revenue sources are down at a time when people are turning to the public sector for help and assistance. It's a misalignment of resources that is exacerbating some of the problems that people are rightfully critical of across the country.
Great. Playing off of resources then, most cities and most states, with the notable exception of California, have budgets that are either in the red or dangerously close to being in the red, thanks to the decline of the tax base that you're talking about. And of course, as you all know, cities, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budgets. There's no such thing as deficit spending. Are you pushing, or how are you pushing the incoming federal government for a new stimulus package that includes state and local government aid that got left out of the one in December?
Well, I don't want to jump the gun here, but I'll be meeting with my federal delegation as soon as I am with you guys. I've said it to them before. We have a great delegation here in Baltimore and in Maryland. They understand and know that we need that direct support. They've been able to help in some instances, even with this current administration, to get us direct support. And I know they will continue to push that message. It's critically important for cities to get that direct funding so that we can close those gaps that would not be there. You know, we were expecting a surplus here in Baltimore before the pandemic.
So our delegation has dramatically shifted in the last election. We lost 2 Democratic Congresspeople, but obviously we're pushing hard, and you know, we can't do it alone. We've got to have the federal government help us out here. I'm really looking at a deficit for next year's budget that is pretty horrifying. And okay, where did it go? It went away.
Did it cut off? And now
And
I'm
Mayor,
on mute.
Madam Mayor, we
Gloria.
can still hear you and see you, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Okay. All right. We're using, okay. So the deficit situation, and look, we haven't grappled, and maybe you two and your places have, with the full prediction for evictions and continued unemployment. I've been really pushing hard to have a clear vision for what is going to be involved, so we can be making the decisions right now about how we're going to forestall the crisis.
Angela, if I may say, I have been extremely happy with the incoming administration. They have been available to myself and to my team. We were able to meet with Julie Rodriguez, the incoming director of intergovernmental relations, to explain where San Diego's at and how we can work collaboratively. You can imagine in a city like San Diego, we're a proud military town. We're the beneficiaries of a tremendous amount of federal spending. We're on the US-Mexican border. Last 4 years have been disastrous for our relationship with our partners in Baja California. So there is a lot of active issues that are there. And so the outreach and the communication has been great. Like my colleagues also been knocking on the doors of our House members and our senators, including our soon-to-be appointed Senator Alex Padilla, who thankfully, as I think some of us on this call are, we're former council presidents. He knows local government. He understands what we're dealing with. I think he'll bring that local perspective to the Senate when he's appointed, hopefully later this month. So I'm hopeful about those lines of communication, and the feedback we're getting is music to my ears, particularly in contrast to what we've had coming out of the White House the last 4 years. But we need to make it real because, as I mentioned before, every single day that passes without the certainty of resources means that vaccination superstation that we have at the Padres Stadium cannot be replicated in those Black and brown communities near our tourism hotspots where we need to get workers back to work. As Mayor Levine Cava had mentioned, we are seeing higher rates of unemployment. We are seeing some levels of eviction participation. We have a stay-at-home order currently in California. We've been under it for over 2 months now. And so that is having tremendous impacts. And so that's where federal and additional state relief, Angela, as you mentioned, the state is a little bit flushed. We, as a former state legislator, we were being very conservative in our revenue projections, and maybe overly conservative. That's never a bad thing. We just need to make sure those additional dollars that were located flow down to the cities, again, who are on the front lines of pandemic response.
And if I could say, I am feeling very optimistic. Obviously, the signals are very good from the new administration that they recognize that the buck stops with us down here in the local community, and we need their help to make sure that our people get the services they need.
Now, one of the three of you, of course, is represented by Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. The other two of you are not. But what sort of communications so far, if any, are you having with the transition, the incoming administration? Are they reaching out at this point to local leaders such as yourselves?
As I mentioned a moment ago, yes, we have. I'm interested to hear this.
Yeah, actually, I've had the pleasure of being on some calls with the Vice President elect personally even over the summertime, and now even leading up to this event. And we've been talking to people in administration. We look forward to just continuing that. Like the mayors have said, they've been very open about communicating, which I think is a great sign for all cities.
Well, I had the pleasure of speaking to Mayor Pete about our transportation challenges here as part of NACO. And so I'm looking forward to more.
Great. I want to make sure I mix in some of the questions from the audience. And Mayor Levine Cava, we have one question here from one of our attendees who notes that Democrats lost significant ground in Miami-Dade in 2020, as you mentioned, with the loss of the 2 House delegation members. And this person is wondering what you think Democrats can do to convince more voters of top-down support for Democratic candidates and policies from your role. And of course, you are succeeding a Republican mayor in this position as well.
Yeah. Well, in my case, it is a nonpartisan seat, even though I think it was well known I was a Democrat. But really, people related to me as someone who cared about them, somebody that was focused on people and their needs. And I think that's what Democrats need to do. I think we need to kind of get out of our own way and really focus on the fact that we are the party that does care about taking care of people first. Well, and the environment.
Now, all 3 of you in your opening remarks highlighted economic inequality and equity issues that, of course, have been exacerbated by everything we've seen in the past year. And while those issues affect various parts of the country, they're especially acute in urban areas like all of you represent. What tools in your toolbox do you have where you might be able to make progress in addressing that seemingly intractable issue that underlies so much of the angst today? Let's start with Mayor Scott on that one.
Yeah, I think that, listen, I always tell folks that when you look at things like this, right, and again, as I said, Baltimore is the birthplace of redlining legislation. We have our budgets. When you talk about a city that like Baltimore, which has spent overwhelmingly its capital dollars in rich white neighborhoods and not poor neighborhoods, poor Black and brown neighborhoods, we can reverse that. We can have that economic development starting with the city supporting that. We can make sure, as we're doing here in Baltimore, right, every capital budget now will have to be graded through a lens of equity. All our employees are going to have equity training. Our agency heads, our directors, every employee down, start myself, I've had it obviously, but that's how we can lead in those issues, making sure that we are pushing that down from the top, making sure that we are investing in a lens of equity, making sure that we're talking to our other partners here, our business partners, our state governments, about how they can help us to break these things. No, I am not going to, in a 4-year term, erase, hundreds of years of racial inequity here in Baltimore City, but someone has to be the person that starts the bottom. The person, I'll always say, and I say this to young people all the time, the person who puts the brick on the bottom of the house is just as important that puts the last one on the top. We have to break the cycle. And right now we're talking about foundational change work. And it starts with leading by example, making sure that your governments are operating that way and assessing all of their policies, right? I always tell folks when they say, well, why did you do this law? Why was it necessary to put it in law? It's not good enough to have a Black person as the mayor, or a woman leading an agency, or someone from the LGBTQ community, or someone who grew up in public housing. If the policies of that agency that they're now overseeing were written 40, 50, 60 years ago by people who didn't think that Black people, that women, that poor people, that members of the LGBTQ community had the same rights as them. You will not erase policy, cause, and equity without undoing the policy themselves. So you have to do all of that, and that work is tough and it's hard, but you have to start, and we're going to start now.
Ditto to Mayor Scott. I have to say that I think our respective elections, all 3 of us, have history components to it. That's not a sufficient achievement to address the inequities in our neighborhood, right? It may provide some hope for folks who didn't formerly feel that they participate in civic life, but we have to follow it up with policy. And I'm here to tell you that we're trying to lead on this, even in this time of austerity. Right now, I'm recruiting for our first ever Office of Race and Equity at the City of San Diego. So if someone's watching the Zoom right now, I want you to put in an application, because we want to be leaders in this regard. I look at these difficult and really dark times that we're in right now as a floor from which we can rebuild, to put that brick down that Mayor Scott was just talking about, starting to build our way back up again. And we want to do it through a lens of equity, not just from a law enforcement perspective, which is where a lot of the attention is, but from a housing perspective, from an education perspective, from an economic development perspective. And we need to have an initiative owner in the city that does that, and looking at everything we do here through that lens. This Office of Race and Equity is new. As I mentioned, we're recruiting, and I want to bring you to San Diego if you think you can help us in this regard. Another thing we're doing this year is starting a climate equity fund, recognizing, as Mayor Levine Cava mentioned, San Diego's on the front lines of climate change as well. We're a coastal community. This is a big deal to us. My observation is that certain neighborhoods are participating more fully in the green revolution than other parts of our community. And we can work with polluters, we can work with our utilities, we can work with others to gain revenue that we can be intentional about making sure that those electric vehicles show up in more than a handful of neighborhoods. That those green jobs are not concentrated in neighborhoods that are far away from our urban centers. There's a lot of ways we can do it. This fund is intended to make sure that those dollars flow. And last thing I would just say with regard to this, and Mayor Scott had it exactly right. I'm looking at a $125 million budget deficit. And I sit here in the mayor's office understanding that I have to close that gap, but I'm going to do it in a way to make sure that understanding that closing a library in a low income, high person of color community has a different impact than if you do that somewhere else. And really making sure that as we responsibly close our deficit, that we do it understanding the impacts to those communities and not doubling down on past discriminatory policies that really kept those communities impoverished. We need to have a different approach, and the pandemic, the recession, and all the horrible things that are happening is really the opportunity to rebuild it back better again.
Well, at POLITICO, we're recruiting for our first newsletter author for Race and Equity newsletter. So good luck filling your position. And if you're journalists out there and interested in the topic, we're also recruiting.
And we are also recruiting. We have our first Office of Equity and Inclusion, and we'll be launching that, and we'll be working on issues specifically of race that have not been explicitly allowed in procurement, for example, by court order, and the tables have turned and the disparities are clear and we're free to move forward. And so in my administration, we'll be doing that, and not only procurement, but department by department, an equity assessment, and changing the culture in county government. So I'm actually going to have a couple of people, one more focused internally on county practices and county policies, another focused more on the community, bringing people into economic opportunity, small business development, have an accelerator that was in my commission district that I'm planning to expand countywide to on those who've been left behind, housing policies, as was mentioned, job opportunities, everything through an equity and inclusion lens. And I'm looking forward to getting ideas from these two mayors, and we are still hiring as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Angela, I just want to say, I forgot to mention that we've already hired our first Chief Equity Officer, Dana Moore, who is a wonderful, wonderful lawyer and lives and breathes equity each and every day.
So and
I got the idea originally 6 years ago with Local Progress from something that was being done in Seattle, and tried to bring it in as commissioner and didn't get as far as it needed to go.
Great. Well, let's move on to climate. Obviously, that is something that all of you have brought up as well, and it's clearly a global issue, but it's also a local issue. As mayors, what are your plans to get started on climate change? And I understand that Mayor Scott has a meeting he has to get to and is going to have to leave shortly. So let's start with you to make sure you get a chance to answer this question along with your colleagues there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Angela. And I think that when people think about climate change, they don't often think about Baltimore, but we are a city that sits basically right on the water as well. And while we have done a pretty decent job of understanding that, again, when you think about climate change, I always tell folks to think about it through a lens of equity, right? We also have to think about communities where the heat, especially here in summertime, we all know mid-Atlantic summers can be brutal, right? When you think about elder citizens who are living in East and West Baltimore, who don't have air conditioning, who all of the things that we have to understand when you're talking about creating a more sustainable future. For us, it's about making sure that are looking at our flood zones also, which are not just our areas around the water. We have now inland flood zones. There are so many different things that have not been thought about for our city and thought about, especially through a lens of equity, how it impacts. This is why we're going to be pushing to go towards zero waste so that we can be more responsible with our city and with our planet, so that we can have a better planet for our children and grandchildren. This is something that we cannot do what those that came before us did. We cannot act like we're going to just do things to be elected in the next 4 years. We have to be thinking about how we're going to put our cities in better places 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years down the line, so that my unborn children and grandchildren will actually have a Baltimore City to live in, one that's sustainable. That's what the push is going to be for us. That's why we're uplifting these things now, so that we can accomplish them.
Well,
Mayor Levine, Cava, let's hear
here
from
we-
you on this. You mentioned it in your opening remarks. I'd like to hear a little more about the new position you created as well with the Bay.
Yeah, thanks. So, well, there are so many issues that we have, but the environment is really a driver for me, because I did not see my predecessor or so many of my colleagues prioritizing, especially the climate change issues and the water. I use water because we are on the water. Our tourism is based on the water. Our health obviously is based on the water, and our drinking water supply is a result of the Everglades. And to the extent that the Everglades are endangered, Everglades restoration is a critical part of protecting our future water as well. So it's a very complicated interplay, and not getting, as I say, the attention. The public does not fully understand the importance of it. But a few months back, there was an amazing, horrible incident of fish, thousands and thousands dying and rising to the surface in Biscayne Bay. And so, these are tragedies that create public awareness. And we already had a Biscayne Bay task force looking at the lack of good, healthy bay conditions that I had been pushing for as well. And one of the recommendations was to have a chief bay officer. So Monday she started, and she's going to be a critical player in helping us get public awareness, engagement, and financial investment and it's a complicated interplay from sea level rise, from the climate, from the heat, from fertilizers, from pollution, all of the things that contribute to a sick bay, which is our primary tourist and economic driver, really, the health of our Biscayne Bay. So there's so many things I could talk about, but that's just a start. I am the water warrior, and that was one of my key themes as campaigning to be mayor, because I care so much about this issue, and I'm making sure that we make the proper investments. And I'm sorry, last thing I'll say, septic to sewer. So with the rising sea, we have many, many people not on the public water sewer system. These septic systems that they have are failing as the water rises, and leading to extraordinary amounts of pollution in our water system.
And Mayor Gloria, climate change.
Sure. Well, I had the honor of authoring our city's landmark climate action plan back in 2015. And at the time, we were the largest American city to commit itself to running on 100% renewable energy by the year 2035. I'm here to tell you that when we passed that back when I was in the city council, there was more than a few critics of that decision. Fast forward 5 years later, the state of California has adopted a similar goal. 6 other states, Puerto Rico, have similar targets. The Biden administration has had this as a central part of their climate platform. I look forward to having the federal leadership to help implement. So I tell people I'm the guy who authored the climate action plan. I ran for mayor to be the guy that implements it. And so what does that mean? Frankly, we have to spend this year updating it. We built in a 5-year look back in the original plan to make sure that we're taking advantage of every lesson learned, every new technology, every new priority. And so we'll spend this month, the next number, updating it to reflect those new realities and those new lessons learned. I think where we can focus is having the city be a leader in this regard. One of the side effects of COVID has been no pun intended, has been people working from home. And many of our city employees may be able to continue to do that even after the stay-at-home order is lifted, because we are seeing some productivity increases in certain departments. And that may be a way to push down vehicle miles traveled and reduce carbon emissions. So if we can do it, maybe other employers locally can model that behavior. Even we are constantly in the position of buying vehicles in the city. We got trash trucks, we got police cars, we got all kinds of vehicles. We can do a better job of buying electric or low or no emission. And probably the biggest commitment we're going to be making is we have stood up community choice energy here in San Diego, leaving our traditional utility provider who is gets over 60% of their energy, I should say around 60% of their energy from fossil fuels, and going to a community choice program, San Diego Community Power, that intends to get all of its energy from renewable sources. The San Diego can be one of its first customers. It launches for industrial users in a couple of weeks. And it's my hope that we can start transitioning city facilities to be run by San Diego Community Power and rather than fossil fuels. I think that would be a big statement for where we're going as a city to meet the challenge of climate change.
Right. Given the events, especially of the past week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the political climate everywhere in the country and hear from both of you about what you think your role as mayors is in, or is there a role for you as mayors in taking the temperature down on that? What is your role in healing the partisan divide, all of that we've seen escalate in so many parts of the country, certainly including both South Florida and Southern California. Mayor Gloria, of course, your predecessor is now leading a recall effort to try to take Governor Newsom out of office, and you compared that to the Capitol riot. So things are certainly very tense pretty much everywhere. But we'd love to hear from both of you on that topic. Let's start with Mayor Gloria there.
Yeah, I mean, a part of that observation about the recall is about calling for that kind of lowering of the temperature. I see in the news reports across the country, people are very upset with elected officials because they're upset with where things are at currently. And we are easy to hold accountable. And I welcome the accountability. But these efforts to distract, is not what we need. We need the governor, the state government focused on dispersing dollars to local cities and counties to get COVID under control and get our economy going again. And the distraction of a recall is precisely that. It isn't, my predecessor has indicated his interest in being governor of California. Things are not going perfectly here in San Diego with regard to COVID, right? We had protesters out on the streets in one of our neighborhoods this past weekend, resulting in 5 of my police officers being injured and several people going to jail. So the idea that changing actors is going to change the pandemic, I don't subscribe to that. And in fact, what I think we have to have are experts. We have seen at the national level what having amateurs running our response has done to our ability to contain the virus. We need people who have experience, who know what they're doing, and who have been at the table for the pandemic from the beginning to make sure that we finish it off. To your question, Angela, about what we can do, well, I think Mayor Levine Cava got to it a moment ago. We are nonpartisan elected officials. I think people widely understood that we are both Democrats when we were elected, but here we are. When we were seeing the protesters in the streets over the weekend, we had people in support of the president, we had people opposed the president, and it was my direction to our law enforcement officers to treat them equally. If you have people breaking the law on either side, doesn't matter what their ideology is, they should be arrested. And then I think, importantly for this national conversation, because I think what you're really getting to is the third crisis that I'm very concerned will get lost in the overwhelming amount of news relative to the pandemic and to the economic crisis, is this racial crisis that we have. And I don't want this to get pushed off the headlines simply because we're all concerned about our health and our household's ability to provide for ourselves. We have to take this as the challenge that it is. I'm trying to do that. It sounds like my colleagues here are doing it as well. Despite our budget challenges, we're going to invest more than $1 million this year in a new police accountability review commission to make sure that we're identifying law enforcement officers who do not share our culture of equity and inclusion and remove them from law enforcement. We're doing that major financial commitment despite the enormous budget deficit that we're seeing, because I want us to rise up to the occasion that people have been marching in our streets since May about. So I look forward to playing a productive role in this by getting folks not to get distracted by those who are trying to exploit these opportunities for political gain, and instead do the difficult work on the ground level to do things like holding law enforcement accountable. If we can do that, we will not miss the opportunity presented by this third crisis and actually be able to tell people we did something about it.
Well, let me say that I got into government elected office late, but I was not late to the discussion about government accountability. And I was working outside government to create public engagement, public awareness and advocacy around community needs. I was training advocates basically to speak truth to power. And I believe that government has an opportunity to build trust through actions. It's my intention to be very, very clear and transparent in everything I do, create much more access to open data, much more communication, much greater ease for public input. And of course, just to communicate, especially during crises like this one. Look, we're not going to be as distracted by a president's temper tantrums. We're going to be able to stay focused on things that are really important to our people. And we'll be able to, I believe, use this as the opportunity to deliver, build trust, and reshape the narrative about government. And so I think we've really been handed a great opportunity to get past these partisan divides that most people don't dominate most people's daily lives, and find solutions that will be the cornerstone of what people want to see from their government.
I want to make sure we have time to talk about school reopenings also. Obviously, both Florida and California are states that have had mixed success with opening, closing, et cetera, schools in recent months. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing to lay out plans for the rest of this school year, to be ready to be able to do either in-person instruction when you think you can, or to do virtual instruction well. And how are you talking with teachers' unions, with parents? There's obviously competing interests to balance in this whole big question.
Well, I'll start by first saying I don't have real responsibility for what happens with schools. We have a separate school board. The decisions about open and close are driven again by our governor. The governor has been really on the side of leaving things open, not having many restrictions. The teachers have been quite upset about this. Many teachers are themselves very vulnerable. Some options for at-home learning coupled with physically present has reduced risk, but truthfully, we have a situation where our teachers and children are very much at risk in the school system. They have not been prioritized for vaccines, the teachers. As county government, we have access to the testing and to the vaccination once the governor gives us the go-ahead for priorities. So we have provided access to testing on site for teachers to be a good partner. And we have supported identifying teachers as priority for vaccination. Other than that, I can be supportive, I can be sympathetic, but I don't have a lot of control. I am hopeful that with new federal dollars, we'll be able to design some programs to deal with the learning lag that is occurring by virtue of the number of children who are out of school or not able to access platforms. I'm very troubled by that. We have many people who could use the jobs, a real core of public sector involvement to help our children not fall further behind.
I would just say, like Miami-Dade, the city of San Diego does not have jurisdiction over our schools, but I'm never one to say that I don't have responsibilities in education. Quite the opposite. My job is building a great city, and you can't do it without great schools. Angela, I can tell you more about, or give you a better answer in about an hour. Because as soon as I log off of this Zoom, on a different Zoom with our school superintendent and our school board members to talk about this very issue. They made an announcement today that their previous plan for reopening isn't possible. You know, our current infection rate in our county is more than double what is the allowable rate for schools to reopen under the state stay-at-home order. So we're a ways away from being able to reopen. Going to a previous point in the conversation this morning, or this morning in San Diego, this afternoon where you all are, is the fact that we don't get direct receipt of vaccinations. If the city did, I'd be partnering right away with our school district to make sure our teachers get front of the line service, because we cannot reopen our economy until our schools are reopened, and so that parents can have their kids going to school and businesses can function with the full complement of their staff. So I would like to see that happen. Again, this is a decision that's determined by the state and the county, but we can play an advocacy role. A role that I can see is that if we turn our school sites into vaccination centers, which I think is really smart. You know, we have a neighborhood school in every neighborhood in the city. These are known places where San Diegans feel comfortable, and where we can potentially send some of those firefighters that we've trained to give the vaccinations to get those out quicker. Again, it's a resource question. In the meantime, or not waiting until we get the vaccination perfectly distributed. The first number of months of this year, we are going to expand Wi-Fi access at our city's recreation centers, as well as boost the number of laptops and Wi-Fi hotspots that are available to patrons at our branch libraries. These are ways to try and address the digital divide for the tens of thousands of San Diegans who have been sheltering at home, but don't have access to a computer and don't have direct access to the internet.
Yeah, I would add as well, we've added access at libraries and expanded the reach of the internet to the parking lots in different ways and publicize that, and working with some of our internet providers to create greater access. I'd like the idea of schools as a site for vaccination. I'm going to carry that one forward. Thank you.
Great, and we are close to being out of time, but I want to cover one more topic, which Mary Gloria, you brought up in your opening remarks, and one of our participants here today has asked about, and that's homelessness. I think if I have my stat right, you said that San Diego has the 8th highest homeless population of any metro. Was not quite right on that.
I talk really fast, so I don't blame you at all. We are the 8th largest city in the country, but we have the 5th largest homeless population.
Even worse than 8. Okay. Well, obviously, President Trump kept tweeting about, before he lost his Twitter account, of course, kept tweeting about San Francisco's homeless population. So apparently he missed that fact also. But obviously, a huge issue even before the pandemic, and it's another one of the many areas of economic inequality that has been exacerbated in the past 10 months. So quickly, since we're almost out of time, give me a couple highlights on what each of you has in store to try to address homelessness, especially through the lens of the pandemic.
Yeah, happy to jump in, and I'll do it very quickly, although stop me, because this is the passion issue of my career. And so it happens to be that we have a homelessness crisis. I told San Diegans, maybe it's time we had a homeless advocate in the mayor's office, and here I am. One of the things we did here in San Diego was take our convention center, which is unused, and convert it into an enormous interim homeless shelter. It's been operating since April, and we've successfully permanently housed 1,200 San Diegans and their families over this period of time. That program is winding down soon because we are moving to a permanent housing, supportive housing model. The previous administration wasn't fully embracing of housing first. I am, and we will make that the stated policy of our administration. I've recruited Matthew Doherty, who was the Obama administration's executive director for the Interagency Council on Homelessness, to assist us in this effort. And there are no simple solutions to homelessness. This is a very complex problem that's going to require focused and tenacious efforts. But if there was a simple solution, we have to build more housing. And the fact of the matter is, we are not building nearly enough housing for really any part of our market except for the luxury end of the San Diego market. And so we have to build a lot more homes. There are a lot of seniors on fixed incomes. There are a lot of veterans who receive VA benefits. We have a lot of low-wage workers who do have sources of income that don't earn enough to be able to live in the city. And that's how they end up on our streets, in our canyons, living in their cars. An administration that prioritizes the construction of low and moderate income housing will be one that can actually successfully address this issue. I want San Diego ranks of cities that have ended chronic homelessness. If Rockford, Illinois, if Provo, Utah, if those communities can do it, San Diego can do it.
Well, I completely concur. It's basically another situation where we just don't have the housing, and certainly what we have is too expensive for anyone to afford. We have actually the biggest gap between income and cost of living in Miami-Dade, unfortunately. But we are going to have this short-term crisis because while the eviction moratorium is on now, it's not going to last forever, and we are going to need to scale up. I'd like to see us buying hotels that might be underutilized because of the pandemic. I'd like to see us creating some of the emergency locales like Mayor Gloria mentioned. And then we have to wrap around services and help people get longer term housing. So I have an aggressive plan to utilize public surplus lands for housing, reduce permitting time, construction costs, build higher density, build mixed income, a whole range of things that together will help resolve the issue. But it's not a short-term fix. It's a longer-term solution.
Thank you. Clearly, we could have an entire hour on any of these given topics, but for today, we are out of time. So I would like to thank both of you as well as Mayor Scott for joining us today, for the Democratic Mayor's Conference for hosting this event, and for all of our attendees for being here. And following up on many of these topics, I hope to see many of you next week on the 21st at the Politico 50 Mayors Summit, where we'll be convening similar mayors to talk about many of these big issues as well then.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to meet you, Mayor Gloria.
Likewise.